Okay, welcome back to this video. This is gonna be my 2020 wrap up, and you know what? I know people are not gonna stick around to listen to me talk about books for like half an hour, so I'm gonna try my best to wrap the books up in at least like maybe 1 or 2 minutes each. Okay, to be honest, I only really started reading books in May this year because prior to that I was still in school, so I wasn't really reading. I was trying my best to complete school and trying my best to keep sane, so I had no time for books. I only started reading in May, and the very first book that I read was This Changes Everything by Naomi Klein. I mean, I've talked about this book too many times on this channel, so it's a great book. It's about climate change and capitalism. I think that you should go and read it if you haven't already. The second book that I read was Brotopia. It's a pretty good book. I would say that it's very contemporary. It's definitely a problem that only really is a problem of because of today's circumstances, like with the tech industry and etc. It's kind of not very relevant to my life at this point, but I do think that for those of you who might be very interested in tech and the tech industry, I think it's a very worthy read. It really just was a journalistic expose of the industry. Now, the third book that I read, at least what I remember, is Bullshit Jobs by David Graeber. And David Graeber passed away earlier in 2020, which is so sad. I think his works are phenomenal. He's an anthropologist. And I would say that his writing, Bullshit Jobs is probably the most casual writing that he had. His other books are a lot more theoretical and academic. So I would recommend reading his other books as well. I think they're a lot more rigorous, but Bullshit Jobs really touches on some key ideas that I really cannot shake off. The idea of work, what labor should be valued as such. And I think his solution, he didn't claim to give solutions, but I think that would be the work of a lot of social scientists and sociologists and anthropologists to answer, I think, in the next few years. And I'm looking forward to that. Now, moving on, I'm really going super fast because just so many books. Pleasure Activism by Adrienne Maree Brown. I loved this book so much. I think it's one of my top books of 2020. Adrienne Maree Brown, like this book was more of a series of interviews and reflections and essays. It's a whole mix of things. It's really about the idea of pleasure driving change, driving social change. And Adrienne Maree Brown is someone I really, really respect, and I do want to model after their like kind of activist work. Really definitely this triggered a whole slew of me really being very hungry for social justice frameworks that have joy and pleasure as the foundation. Next book that I read was Naysayer's Book Club by Simon Vincent. This is a Singapore book. It's about a few of the very public civic figures in Singapore, and basically Simon Vincent interviewed these people in front of their bookshelves and asked them questions about their reading and their history and how they came to be the civic figures they are today. And I really, really enjoyed this book. I think this is such an interesting local literature, so I really recommend, if you're Singaporean, to pick up this book. I think it's kind of a rabbit hole book, so once you read different interviews and you see figures that you are kind of interested in, you want to read more about their history and maybe some of the books that they're interested in. I picked up like 40 plus books to add to my TBR just from this book alone. Now, the next book that I read was You're Not Listening by Kate Murphy, if I'm not wrong. It's a very simple book. I enjoyed it. It's really about the act of listening. It's about like how the act of listening is not really something that we practice intentionally today. That's basically all I got from the book. It's very simple read. I think I finished it in a day or two, and yeah, it's interesting, fascinating, a bit far removed from my context, but it was a good break from the more kind of like difficult theoretical stuff that I was trying to understand. In between that, there were two books that I was reading called Air Conditioned Nation Revisited by Cherian as well as Notes on the Death of Culture by Vargas Llosa. I did not manage to finish either of them. The one by Vargas Llosa, I lost interest halfway through, so I'm not going to read that anymore. But Cherian, I might try and pick up the book again this year and finish it, because I think it's I'm like halfway through. The next book that I read was Siapa Kamu by National Gallery in Singapore. It's not really a book, it's a gallery publication of the artworks in that exhibition. It's basically an exhibition talking about the history of Singapore art. Honestly, I think it's an alright book. Very, very superficial, the questions that it asks. And definitely towards the end, I felt that there was emphasis on Chinese art, like the Nanyang movement. And I would have been more interested in figuring out more of like, you know, like intercultural kind of expressions of Singapore identity. However, it kind of fell short of that. So that's something I'm taking note of. Subsequently, I did read Eating Chili Crab in the Anthropocene, Environmental Perspectives on Life in Singapore. This is by Matthew Schneider-Mayerson. I mean, he edited the book. And it's just a bunch of essays about environment in Singapore. And I would say that this book really caused a stir in the local bookstagram community. Definitely because there has never really been a climate change book about Singapore that's written more for like mass reading or like the mass audiences. A lot of environmental perspectives in Singapore were mostly kind of like in the science and the historical realm of academics and like more serious people. But in this case, this book was quite widely marketed and published, marketed and also kind of shared amongst like smaller book clubs. And I think with this book there was a greater consciousness amongst locals about, you know, reading about climate change and contextualizing climate change issues in Singapore, which I really appreciated. I really appreciated how the community was kind of waking up to those ideas. That really showed me that these books had a real effect, I guess, on people and on people's perceptions of the environment. And I'm very glad, like now if someone asks me about climate change in Singapore, I would definitely ask them to read this book. Now moving on, I did read Imperial Creatures by Timothy Barnard. It's about humans and animals during the colonial period in Singapore. I think that in this period of time, I was still regarding academic work as kind of like the pinnacle of knowledge. That was kind of how I was feeling in the third quarter of the year. I just felt like there were all these questions and I had to turn to very rigorous knowledge production, people who did those kind of things as their job to kind of figure out those answers to my questions. And I enjoyed the book. I definitely do think that there's just so much about environmental issues that it's kind of still stuck in a very inaccessible place. And I see a lot of local activists who are trying to break that barrier and trying to bring that knowledge more to the masses, which I really appreciate, and kudos to them, really. Afterwards, I kind of read, you know, a whole bunch of books. If this wrap-up doesn't really make sense, that's because I have so many different threads that were going on in my life at the time. If you do want a thematic cover of different things I've covered in 2020, you can check out my Instagram. I have IGTV videos that talk about things thematically, but I'm going through all these books chronologically. So after reading Imperial Creatures, I read Untamed by Glennon Doyle. I would say that I wouldn't really recommend this book. Yeah, I think Glennon Doyle made a lot of sweeping remarks that would feel resonant with an American audience, but definitely not with me. But I think because I was reading this at a point in my life where I was thinking about social justice and I was thinking about the personal being political, so I did learn some things from this book. Reading books is also about when you're reading them and in what context you're reading them. So you could be reading a really shitty book, but it had a very profound message that stood true for you at that time. So it really is like that. I mean, there's no objective stance on certain books, I believe. Okay, after that, I did pick up a book called Brani, Memories of an Island. It's about the people who used to live on Pulau Brani before they were asked to move to the main island in Singapore. And I would say that it's really very rare to learn about indigenous people in Singapore because their narratives tend to be kind of erased. And I think that this is my obligation as well to learn about the indigenous Malay people in Singapore and to figure out what stories, what histories that they have that are not being told in like the dominant narrative in Singapore. So that's also another thread that was going on in my life then. Okay, afterwards I read Botany of Desire by Michael Pollan. I really love this book. I think Michael Pollan is a fantastic writer. I think if you're interested in reading about the environment, but not one that's necessarily about climate change, you can pick this book up. I think that this book really made me question my relationship with the environment and the planet and with nature. And basically, what is man? What is nature? What is human? Yeah, big questions. I know. Forgive me for that. I mean, but it's a great book. I would recommend that. Afterwards, I read Happy City by Charles Montgomery. I would say I'm ambivalent about this book. I think this book is interesting for those of you who are interested in cities, like city junkies. Everything that Charles Montgomery says here is not something new, I think. He writes in a very ideal and optimistic way, which could be uplifting for some of you to read. And it talks about urban design. I would recommend it for people who are new to reading about cities and about design, like urban design. After that, I did read Indonesia, etc. by Elizabeth Pisani, and Indonesia, etc. What am I saying? And I really enjoyed this book. I think I was a bit worried that Pisani, being someone who grew up overseas and only came to Indonesia as a researcher, plus the fact that she's like a white woman who, you know, is coming in as an expertise in her own field. But what really saved it for me was that she was aware of this, and she was very aware of her outsider insider kind of identity, and she was very careful to kind of like back up her credentials and to say that she has worked in the country for very long and she has had these relationships with these locals in certain ways, and that you as the reader, you can judge whether these relationships are authentic or not. I mean, I did feel that they were authentic enough for me to believe her words and to continue reading. She doesn't romanticize traveling in Indonesia. I do think there's a good dash of sociological understanding of the country, as well as her own personal experiences and her own personal kind of like feelings and sentiments towards the country, which I really appreciated. So after that, I did pick up a few graphic novels. I picked up Sabrina by Nick Grasno. This comic was very unsettling. I found it disturbing, and I think that was the intention of the book. I wouldn't say it was pleasant, but I don't think good books always have to be pleasant. Do pick it up if you're interested in like sort of like the contemporary mindscape of an American, in a place of like media distrust and all that. I think it's genius, but it wasn't fun to read. I read The Orchid Folios by Mok Zining. This is a local poetry collection, and I loved it. I think it was so much in line with my ongoing exploration of human versus environment, and Mok Zining like really took on that metaphor, like really used the metaphor of the orchid to describe like the Singapore condition, or to describe the experience of living in this country, growing up, going through the education system here, and sort of just societal expectations. I would recommend this regardless of whether you're Singaporean or not. I would recommend this poetry collection. I think it really condenses the essence, I think, somewhat of the ironic essence of being Singaporean today. Ways of Saying by John Berger. As you can tell, my reading taste is really all over the place. This won't make sense a lot chronologically, I realize, but I mean, this is a wrap up, okay? It's not gonna make sense. Anyway, I did read Ways of Saying by John Berger. Loved it. I loved this book. I would read it again in the future, and I would read John Berger's other works. Okay, next, I read A Guide to Eco-Anxiety, How to Protect the Planet and Your Mental Health by Anucha Gross. And I think this book it's a really good book for those of you who are now coming to terms with how you might be contributing to climate change and you feel a bit guilty about it, because the fact is, like, we're all complicit, right? And so it's about how you manage your anxiety in a way that helps you, and the fact that eco-anxiety is different from usual forms of anxiety because it's a trigger that you can't really get rid of. So you can't be like, okay, the world is actually not going to end, because the climate change is real, so you can't really treat that trigger the same way you might treat other triggers. Yeah. In the same vein, I also read The Story of More by Hope Yaren. I wouldn't really recommend this book. I think it's very simple, but and also it's very American focused. I think it's alright. I do think that there are a lot of climate change books out there, and I think this book is slightly more optimistic than the other books I've read. So maybe if what you're looking for is a more brief and optimistic view on climate change, yeah, you can read this book. But I did feel that the analogies in it were a bit sweeping and not the most well crafted analogies, but I mean, it wasn't an unpleasant read. I did read Homeless by Liana Damira. It's a story of a mother's struggle in crazy rich Singapore. I think this book is really important and very profound. I don't know what else to say about it. I think Liana is such an amazing businesswoman as well. I think she really defeated the odds against her and rose up. But the worst point of the whole story was that the odds were so stacked against her. I think that is the aspect of the story that made me reflect a lot about the way things are done here in Singapore, and the fact that help is so difficult to obtain if you're of a certain kind of place in life. Say for example, you might be of a certain lower class demographic, or you could be struggling, you could be facing racial discrimination, but the state doesn't really recognize that. And I think that's very, very frustrating, and I felt that frustration in that book. But Liana is really honestly such an inspiring person, and I'll be looking forward to support any of her other ventures, I guess. She did get into politics in Singapore as well, so that's amazing. Okay, afterwards I read Fashionopolis by Dana Thomas. I enjoyed this book. I think it was a good break from the more environmental aspect towards more of sustainability. Of course, the scope of the book was still based mostly on luxury fashion, so it's not really a book that covers all aspects of fashion. Okay, next was Dancing at a Pity Party by Tyler Feder. I really, really enjoyed this book, and I think this graphic novel really showed me the power of graphic novels. I highly enjoyed this book, and I would definitely want to read it again in the future. It talks about grief and talks about loss, but in a very human way, and I just really enjoyed it. So yes, highly recommended if people want to read graphic novels. Okay, after that I did read The Sixth Extinction by Elizabeth Colbert. Now this is also in line with the climate change theme that I was going for, and this is more of the biological side. This is more of the evolutionary side of things, and I felt like it was a very good book to read at that time of my life. Definitely woke me up again in terms of the mass extinction that's happening today. Yeah, as you can tell, climate change, I was really reading as much as I could. I was reading the sustainability part of it, and then the environmental part, and then our relationship with nature, and then the extinction part. And I'm still reading a lot of books about climate change now, so yes. So I did read Funny Weather by Olivia Laing. It's a collection of essays that she writes about different arts, and because she's a art critique, it's tender, it's real, it's full of sentiment, and it's full of meaning. I really, really enjoyed her writing, and because of her writing, I think I was beginning to get very invested in understanding art from my own perspective, and then starting to create art. So this idea of me trying to create art is a relatively new thing, but mostly triggered by this book. Afterwards, I did read Iwagara by Enrique Salmon, who's an indigenous author and also a professor of ethnobotany, which is super cool. This book is more of a dictionary. It's what's it called? Not a dictionary, encyclopedia of the most important plants to the indigenous community in the Native American community. And I think I really loved it. It was reading an encyclopedia. There was the entry, the pictures, the descriptions, the scientific kind of components of the plants, its uses. What I liked most was how the author included stories, because there are plants that have an entire origin story. They have certain cultural significance, and that was the part I really, really enjoyed. Moving on, I did read Feminist City by Leslie Kern. As I mentioned, I did read Happy City before that, and while I did enjoy Happy City then, I think only after I read Feminist City that I realized that Happy City was lacking in many ways. I wouldn't say that Leslie Kern's book Feminist City really covered everything, but rather her premise was very clear. It was just to incorporate a feminist perspective into urban studies, and I think she was pretty successful at it. It was just very brief, but I think powerful enough to question how urban studies is generally done. Okay, I read Creationism by David Balzer, but I didn't like the book. I felt that it was too clunky, it had too many difficult words, and I didn't really learn much from it, so I'm just gonna skip that. Okay, afterwards I did read This Book Will Change Your Mind About Mental Health by Nathan Filer. It was a very straightforward book. I appreciated it. I think it's a good book, good starting book for those who are a bit hesitant to read about mental health. I think this is definitely about schizophrenia. I think Filer subsequently renamed the title of the book, which I felt was a lot more accurate. And yeah, I mean, that's basically it. I think it's really about dismantling the stigma of mental illness. I think Filer did so quite successfully for schizophrenia, not really much for other disorders or other conditions, but I think it's good enough. I do think that his writing is humble and his writing was resonant and human, and I think that's the most important when you're writing nonfiction, is that you don't want to sound like you are a know-it-all, because no author is really a know-it-all. I mean, a nonfiction author only knows about their field of expertise, so I really appreciated that tone. Afterwards, I did read The Dance Cure by Dr. Peter Lovat. It's a cute book. It's very uplifting, and it's about dance. Dance is like the second love of my life. What's my first? So yeah, I think it's a cute book, very simple, straightforward. If you like dancing, I think you will enjoy this book, because there's not a lot of books out there that talk about dance, surprisingly. Afterwards, I did read Everything is Beautiful and I'm Not Afraid, a Baobu collection by Yao Xiao. This is a kind of collection of comics and illustrations by Yao Xiao, who is a illustrator based in the US, and this bunch, as in these stories, talk about their experience being a queer Asian immigrant in the US. Really loved it. I think nowadays I'm really into illustration, so I really enjoyed this book. I also, the fact that the character is a small little girl with orange hair, that's me.